Hey everybody, Radical Dreamer Steve back at you with another gaming video. Today we're talking about Final Fantasy. With the FF Pixel remasters finally making it to certain consoles, it is now easier than ever to play pretty much every mainline entry of the most iconic JRPG series of all time. Now, I did contemplate adding every single entry 1 to 16, but honestly, starting with 11, they start getting experimental, and I start liking them kind of less, to be honest, so I've chosen Final Fantasy X to be that watershed game that kind of blurs the line between classic and modern FF. So, let's rank all the classic Final Fantasies 1 to 10. What's the absolute worst Final Fantasy game? Well, you guessed it, it's Final Fantasy II. This originally came out for the Famicom, but Westerners would not be able to experience the real Final Fantasy II until the Final Fantasy Origins collection on PS1. And I kind of like to attribute this game to being one of those really weird 8-bit sequels, not so different from something like Mario 2, Castlevania 2, or Zelda 2, where it's just a little bit different and not as good as the original game. Now, unlike Final Fantasy I, this game has a named protagonist, in-name characters, actual story, and lines of dialogue. But it's still a black sheep sequel, and the problem with it really comes down to 1, the battle system. The leveling system is gone, you don't level up, you gain individual stat increases, or dun dun dun, decreases. Yay. Depending on what version you play, that is. On the Pixel Remaster version, they've gotten rid of the stat decreases, but if you play one of the older versions, it's there. So, for instance, if you use your physical attack more, you'll gain strength. If you take damage more, you'll gain defense, and so on. The game is also super open, allowing players to explore really large swaths of the world map, even at the start of the game, which leads to a little bit of confusion and a lot of cheap game overs. I will readily admit I've never made it very far in this game. I don't really find it fun. Yeah, it looks kind of like Final Fantasy, it sounds kind of like Final Fantasy, but to me, this game just isn't that fun. That said, if you're really looking to try it, I do think the FF Pixel Remaster is the way to go. It looks and sounds better than ever, stat decreases have been taken out, and you can turn off random encounters. Next is Final Fantasy I, the game that started it all. It was released in 1989 on the NES in the US. In Japan, Dragon Quest III received far more critical acclaim, but Enix's slow localization pretty much meant that Western fans got the choice of Dragon Quest I and Final Fantasy I at the same time, despite Dragon Quest I being a 3-year-old game at that time. Anyway, I digress. FF1 had a completely customizable party with a few class options. You got your classic classes like your White Mage, Red Mage, Thief, Warrior. And the adventure is definitely old school. You traverse from town to town, dungeon to dungeon, grinding and leveling up, and if you get lost, you need to talk to every NPC in sight to figure out where to go next. To put it simply, FF1 is simplistic fun, but most of the strategy and customization of later entries is kind of missing here. Instead, you just level up, get the newest equipment, and that's how you beat the game. It is worth experiencing once to see where the series began, but new players should definitely temper their expectation because this is an old school 8-bit JRPG through and through. I pretty much recommend the Pixel remasters for all of FF 1 through 6, but the GBA version of Final Fantasy I is also great, and that's the way I beat the game many, many years ago. Next is Final Fantasy III, which is the final Famicom Final Fantasy game. And yeah, you can probably tell I'm not super into 8-bit RPGs, and honestly, I don't think the series really managed to find its complete footing until Final Fantasy IV. That said, Final Fantasy III is the best of the original trilogy. But the story reverts back to Final Fantasy I style storytelling. You get whiteboard, pretty much blank slate, Onion Knights who can be promoted into any class, and you can't even tell who's talking when there's dialogue. This makes it more similar to Final Fantasy I than Final Fantasy II, which is good and bad. The class system's expanded here, and there's a ton of classes here, like 30 of them or something. Unlike later games though, it's very simplistic. You can't mix and match abilities. Instead, you pick a job, you level up, and you can use the skills attached to that class as you are that class. Another thing to note here is that the music's actually really good. This is the first time, in my opinion, that the series composer, Nobuo Uematsu, created something that's near perfect, and it really does enhance the experience a lot. So Final Fantasy III is the best of the Famicom trilogy, but it never really reaches the pinnacle of the later games, mostly due to the very generic storytelling and relatively short adventure. This game's a hard one to recommend. If you want a more modern remake of it, the DS version's great, but if you'd rather get something closer to the original, definitely go with the Pixel Remaster. Next is Final Fantasy IV. I know I will definitely be criticized for some people for ranking this so low, but it's really a testament to how good the other games in this series are, not how bad FF4 is, because this, in my opinion, is the very first game that kind of finally puts everything together. So Final Fantasy IV was first released on the Super Nintendo, and Westerners got this game as Final Fantasy II, because 2 and 3 on the Famicom never made it over. Everything kind of comes together here. The game's story comes together, the characters are great, the battle system's fun, the world's fun to explore, there's some side quests, and yeah, people remember kind of the protagonist Cecil and him committing these atrocities and having to rebut the Empire on the other side of things, and I think people feel a lot of sympathy for Rydia as well. You see her family and her village destroyed, and she experiences the game as a child and an adult. And honestly, this game has a pretty tragic tale. Most of the characters end up dying or having something horrible happen to them by the end of the game, and it's kind of the beginning of melodrama in Final Fantasy games. But that said, classes are gone. Each character is locked into a class. This is somewhat disappointing, but it does allow Final Fantasy IV to maintain focus on the adventure at hand, and everything is just good enough where it's a really good game for the time. I would say it's simplistic in terms of modern gameplay, in terms of the story and the way it's designed, but it's still a really good game and it has a fantastic soundtrack. So this one's absolutely worth playing once. I personally recommend the Pixel Remaster, but some people do swear by the Final Fantasy IV remake on the DS, and there's also the FF4 Advance, which is a great version to play. And even actually Chronicles on PS1's good. Basically any version of FF4 you play is fun. Next is Final Fantasy V. Weirdly, Squaresoft did not bring the Super Nintendo middle entry Final Fantasy V to fans in the West until Final Fantasy Anthology on PS1. Final Fantasy V seems more in line with FF1 and FF3. It's almost like they made the odd games jump backwards in story and added class systems to them. The story here is basically, let's save the crystals and save the world from the evil wizard Exdeath. Blah, 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 blah. This might be the most humorous entry in the series, though honestly I think it's questionable how the humor lands in this game. Some people like it and some don't. Your characters really do seem to turn everything into a joke, even serious things that don't really fit, and Gilgamesh is definitely a comedic distraction. Nevertheless, there are still very powerful moments, such as Faris grappling with her gender identity and Goluf's quest to retain his memory. But FF5 is really all about the class system. There are tens of classes which can be leveled up, and skills can be mixed and matched between classes, trouncing the systems in Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy III. This leads to an insane amount of customization and a lot of grinding for those looking to geek out over the class system. I personally think Final Fantasy V has good aesthetics. The soundtrack's not quite as good as 4 or 6, but still pretty good. And so I think a lot of people do rank this game lower than it deserves. But I also readily admit that this game's pretty much hanging all of its laurels on the well-developed class system and a bunch of side quests. So this is a meaty adventure that takes some steps forwards and some backwards. The best way to play it? Definitely the Pixel Remaster. However, Final Fantasy V Advance, also a great way to experience this game, but I prefer the Pixel Remaster because of all the grinding in this game and the fact that you can increase AP, which makes leveling classes that much easier. Next is Final Fantasy VIII, a game that some people will put on the bottom of their list and some on the top, and it kind of ends smack dab in the middle of mine. It's the very first Final Fantasy game I ever played, and I am well aware that it's a love or hate kind of game. The thing is that I think that FF8 came out after Final Fantasy VII, so it obviously had huge expectations, and they took a full 360 with the style of game they created. FF8 does so much right and so much wrong. It features a junction system, which basically allows you to learn different skills through your GFs, which are summons, and then allocate magic to stats to boost your characters. So there's, again, an insane amount of customization, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is having to draw magic, which is very boring, and having to watch a lot of GF animations since they play a huge part of the battle system in this game. Now, I personally love the world in Final Fantasy VIII. It's a mix of kind of fantasy and sci-fi, and I thought the gardens were a nice touch. But that said, the story is very unfocused. It has a lot of plot holes. It devolves into a love story that essentially leaves the rest of the cast without any purpose. It has one of the worst main villains in the entire series. That said, Final Fantasy VIII has one of the best soundtracks in the series. It has some really great moments like the entirety of Disc 1 in my opinion. And the side quests are really fun, and it has the very best minigame in Final Fantasy history, Triple Triad. So, I will readily admit that Final Fantasy VIII is overwhelming for newcomers, and I don't love it quite as much as I used to, but I still think it's a great game that's just very flawed. As a good friend of mine called it, it is a beautiful mess. Next is Final Fantasy X, which was one of the most anticipated PS2 games at the launch in 2000. I consider Final Fantasy X a classic FF, though it made some critical changes. First of all, it's the first game that has a voice cast. Certain voice actors are definitely better than others, but luckily Final Fantasy X had a great world and a great story. And I really liked, the religious war between the Al Bhed and Yevon, the pilgrimage. I thought that was a really nice touch there with the pilgrimage and the summoner having to sacrifice themselves. And I really felt like every character's place in this world was fleshed out, and I really enjoyed the world I explored. Final Fantasy X also has pretty much the best battle system in the series, in my opinion. It retains being turn-based, but you can swap in and out characters, and gone is the ATB bar. And not to mention that summons directly join you in the battle and have their own HP and attacks. Pretty cool. One of the biggest changes was the sphere grid. There's no more leveling up. Instead, you battle and you gain spheres and you put them on your grid to gain stats. Final Fantasy X isn't perfect. It's a very linear game, and the world maps are gone, and I find the side quest extremely tedious. But that said, the main game here, the summons, the characters, Blitzball itself, there's so much stuff I love about Final Fantasy X. It's a great game that captures most of what made Classic FF awesome, while giving some potential paths for future games in the series, even though they didn't capitalize on that. The best way to experience Final Fantasy X is definitely the remaster that's pretty much on all modern consoles. Number 3 is Final Fantasy VI, one of the personal favorites for most people. This is an absolute masterpiece, and if it were not for Chrono Trigger, this would be my absolute favorite Super Nintendo RPG. Westerners originally got this as Final Fantasy III, but come on, now we all call it Final Fantasy VI. This game does just about everything right, and it's really the first time in the series that everything is synthesized into a near-perfect game. It's got a huge cast of characters, and in battle, they all have their own different skills which are fun to play with, whether you're doing like Sabin's Blitz combinations, or you're doing Gao's ability to turn into monsters. It has a great cast, great abilities to play with, and most of those characters, I don't want to say all, most of them have a really good story arc. It also features the only villain in Final Fantasy history to literally destroy the world and force players to inhabit said world. Final Fantasy's world itself is a beautiful mix of fantasy and steampunk. I love the art direction in this game, the music's perfect and captures the kind of sullen yet adventurous vibe of the game, and the battle system is fantastic. Outside of their abilities, characters later in the game can pretty much learn every magic spell in the game and all become really, really powerful. This makes for a ton of customization. Many consider this to be the very best FF for a good reason. The aesthetics, the story, the characters, the gameplay, it all comes together. And honestly, it is a near perfect game, though there's a couple Final Fantasy games I prefer over it. I think the best way to play this game is any version you can get your hands on, honestly. The SNES version, the Game Boy Advance version. Oh, avoid the PS1 Anthology version. But honestly, the Pixel Remaster is there, and I'm going to recommend it for every game in that collection. So, there you go. Number 2 is Final Fantasy VII, a game that needs absolutely no introduction. This is the PS1 juggernaut that literally made RPGs the coolest genre on the planet for literally years after its release. Final Fantasy VII brought the series into 3D using hideous but charming polygons and pre-rendered backgrounds. Final Fantasy VII is an amazing game for so many reasons, and at its core, I think it brought the world some of the most iconic characters ever, with characters like Cloud, Tifa, and Sephiroth, as well as some of the most iconic moments and locations in gaming, such as Aeris' death that still triggers PTSD for a lot of gamers, and places like Cosmo Canyon and Midgar that are just unforgettable. The story does go a little off the rails, but I think the themes of stuff like eco-terrorism, protecting the planet, and understanding who you are all themes that resonated with 90s kids back then and still really resonate with the world today. The materia system was also a stroke of genius. I mean, there's literally endless combinations to employ, and people who want to tackle the game's super bosses really will need to take advantage of side quests, secret summons, and materia combinations that are just stupidly absurd to overcome them. The music's nothing short of excellent, the world's nothing short of excellent, and honestly, Final Fantasy VII stands as a pillar of the genre itself and remains one of the best RPGs ever made. Number 1 goes to Final Fantasy IX. Anyone who watched my Final Fantasy IX video already knows this is my favorite Final Fantasy. It was the swan song for the PS1, and in many ways it was the swan song for classic FF. Gone were the wild customization that held FF7 through 8 in place. Instead, characters were locked into classes, but they had a number of skills that could be learned from equipping different weapons and armor to them. Final Fantasy IX really does strike a balance between the more somber tones of Final Fantasy VI and VII and the more lightheartedness of stuff like Final Fantasy V. What starts off as a picaresque adventure in order for Zidane and his crew to capture Garnet turns into a beautifully crafted story that really does involve every character. And I think this game has the absolute best cast of characters in the entire series. Dagger, Vivi, Steiner, Freya, seriously. These characters all had such amazing roles to play in the story, they were fun to use in battle, and I just felt like there was so much charm oozing out of all of them. Now I will say, the battle system in Final Fantasy IX is admittedly a little bit slower than something found in, say, Final Fantasy VII, which I think is the game's biggest weakness. But with all the skills you can use in battle, not to mention the beautiful models and backgrounds, I think it's worth putting up with a slightly slower pace, and if you play the new version, remastered version rather, you can end up using fast forward. Final Fantasy IX also is one of the best soundtracks and art directions in the series, and the world is literally loaded with cool places to go and cool side quests to explore. I mean, come on, Choco Hot and Cold has to be one of the best side quests in Final Fantasy history. Alright, I love Final Fantasy IX. You can watch my video on it if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that game individually. That's it for me. That's Final Fantasy 1 through 10 ranked. Tell me what your least and favorite Final Fantasy game is. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Game on.